The people who share your last name, who tuck you in at night, who sit across from you at dinner. They are supposed to be the people you trust without question. A daughter is supposed to be the one person a parent never has to be afraid of. Home is supposed to be the one place where that trust is never in question. But for the families in these cases, that assumption was the most dangerous thing they had. The threat did not come from a stranger at the door or an enemy from outside. It came from inside the house, from the bedroom down the hall, from the child whose school photographs were still hanging on the wall when investigators arrived. These were not accidents or moments of temporary madness that nobody saw coming. These were plans. Some took weeks, some took years, some involved hired help, some were carried out alone. All of them ended the same way, with families destroyed by the one person who was supposed to be part of them. Today we are covering daughters who turned on their own families. Patricia Columbo. Patricia Columbo was 19 years old when she helped end the lives of her father, her mother, and her 13-year-old brother inside their family home in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. The date was May 4th, 1976. The three victims, Frank Columbo, Mary Columbo, and their youngest child, Michael, were found by a neighbor who had grown concerned after not hearing from the family for several days. Patricia had been living away from the family home for 2 years by the time the incident occurred. She was in a relationship with a 39-year-old married pharmacist named Frank DeLuca, and her parents had made it clear from the beginning that they did not approve. The murders were not a sudden act of rage. They were planned, discussed, and attempted multiple times before Patricia and DeLuca finally carried them out themselves. This case fits the theme of daughters who turned on their own families because it contains every element of that story. A daughter who felt her parents were standing between her and the life she wanted, a years-long deception to hide that resentment, and a final act of calculated violence that took 3 lives in a single night. Patricia Columbo grew up in a suburban home in Elk Grove Village, a quiet residential area outside Chicago. Her father, Frank, was a businessman with rumored connections to organized crime figures in the area, though nothing was ever proven. He was protective of Patricia, perhaps overly so, and by many accounts treated her as his favorite child. Her mother, Mary, was described by neighbors and family as someone who focused most of her attention on keeping her husband content, which left Patricia feeling emotionally distant from her. Patricia attended local schools and worked part-time as a teenager. At 15 years old, she took a job at a suburban coffee shop, and in the course of that job, she met Frank DeLuca, who managed the pharmacy next door. DeLuca was in his mid-30s, married, and had 5 children of his own. He hired Patricia to work in his pharmacy, and within a short period of time, the two began a relationship that went far beyond employer and employee. Her parents were aware of DeLuca long before the situation became what it became, and they strongly disapproved. He was married. He was more than twice her age. He was, by their judgment, a deeply inappropriate person for their teenage daughter to be spending time with. The conflict between Patricia and her parents over DeLuca became a defining tension in the household. It did not resolve. It escalated. In April 1974, DeLuca moved Patricia into his own home, despite the fact that he was still living there with his wife and 5 children. The living arrangement was exactly as chaotic as it sounds, and it did not last long. Patricia eventually told her parents she was moving into her own apartment, and they were relieved enough by the prospect of separation from DeLuca that they gave her money to help with the move. What they did not know was that their daughter had already begun thinking about a future that did not include them. By late 1975, the relationship between Patricia and DeLuca had shifted into something darker. Patricia's parents had not warmed to DeLuca. They continued to make their disapproval known, and at some point during that period, Patricia began talking openly to multiple people about having her parents eliminated so that she and DeLuca could be together without interference. This was not passing anger. Patricia approached at least 2 men, identified in court records as Roman and Lanny Mitchell, and asked them directly to carry out the act against her family. She provided Lanny Mitchell with a hand-drawn diagram of the family home. She gave him Polaroid photographs of her father, mother, and brother. She created a personal dossier on each family member with identifying information. She also left the patio door of the family home unlocked on at least one occasion to make access easier. When Lanny arrived at the house one evening to follow through, Mary Columbo answered the door, and he lost his nerve and left. Patricia also learned during this period that her father had taken out what she believed was a contract against DeLuca, a response to the ongoing relationship that Frank Columbo reportedly found deeply threatening. This raised the stakes in Patricia's mind considerably. In January 1976, when meeting with Roman and Lanny, she told them that her younger brother Michael also needed to be included, because he was old enough and observant enough that he might figure out what had happened. None of the men she solicited ultimately followed through. So on the evening of May 4th, 1976, Patricia and DeLuca went to the family home in Elk Grove Village and carried out the plan themselves. Frank Columbo was shot in the head. Mary Columbo was shot, struck with a crystal lamp, and had her throat cut. Michael Columbo, 13 years old, was shot, struck with a bowling trophy, and stabbed 97 times with a pair of scissors. The level of violence directed at the youngest victim, a child, was something that investigators and prosecutors would reference repeatedly throughout the years that followed. After the incident, Patricia and DeLuca returned to their normal routines. She went to work, he went to work. When the bodies were discovered and police began conducting interviews, Patricia was questioned, but initially gave no indication of involvement. She showed little visible emotion during these conversations, a fact that would later be noted by investigators. The break in the case came when a friend of Patricia's, motivated by a reward that had been offered for information, led police to the men she had previously solicited. Those men spoke to investigators and described in detail the months of conversations, the diagrams, the photographs, and the dossiers. DeLuca's employees, who had been silent because he threatened their families, came forward after his arrest and told police they had seen him burning and washing blood-stained clothing the day after the incident at the Columbo home. DeLuca was arrested. Then Patricia was arrested on the morning of May 15, 1976, at the apartment she and DeLuca shared on Finley Road in Lombard, Illinois. During the arrest, a psychiatric evaluation was later conducted at Cermak Memorial Hospital, where a doctor noted that Patricia appeared anxious and depressed. The same doctor noted, however, that during the examination, Patricia expressed feelings of hostility toward her parents and her brother. This was not someone experiencing grief. This was someone experiencing the consequences of a plan that had finally run out of room. The trial began in 1977. Patricia and DeLuca were tried together. The prosecution argued that the motive was twofold. Her parents disapproved of the relationship with DeLuca, and Patricia believed she would inherit the family estate after their deaths. What the prosecution revealed, and what Patricia did not know when she carried out the plan, was that her parents had already removed her from their will. She had taken 3 lives for an inheritance that was never going to be hers. The defense attempted to portray Patricia as someone who had been manipulated by DeLuca, a much older man who had entered her life when she was 15. The jury did not accept this framing. The evidence of Patricia's active role in soliciting the act, planning access to the home, identifying each family member as a target, and including her 13-year-old brother in those plans, was too detailed and too deliberate to attribute to someone acting under another person's control. Both Patricia Columbo and Frank DeLuca were convicted. The judge sentenced each of them to 200 to 300 years in prison. Patricia also received additional years for the solicitation and conspiracy charges, bringing her total exposure to several hundred years. DeLuca received 300 years. At sentencing, the prosecutor described Patricia using language that has been repeated at nearly every parole hearing since, that she represented a complete and deliberate destruction of her own family for personal benefit, and that the inclusion of a 13-year-old child in that plan placed her conduct in a category beyond ordinary violent crime. The families of the victims were left without any of the people they had known. Frank and Mary Columbo had no other children. Michael Columbo had no future. The extended family absorbed the loss and largely withdrew from public view. Frank DeLuca spent the remainder of his life in the Illinois prison system. He died behind bars in 2023 at the age of 84, having served 47 years. Patricia Columbo has appeared before the Illinois Prisoner Review Board more than 15 times seeking parole. She has been denied at every single hearing. At various points, she has described finding redemption through tutoring fellow inmates and through her faith. The prosecutors and investigators who have appeared at each of those hearings have consistently argued the same position, that the nature and scope of what she did, including the deliberate targeting of a child and the months of active planning that preceded the act, disqualify her from release under any circumstances. Raymond J. Mose, the lead investigator on the original case and a former deputy chief of the Elk Grove Village Police Department, has testified against her release at every parole hearing since 1984. At her most recent hearing in March 2026, the board voted unanimously to deny parole once again. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office appeared in opposition. A cousin of Patricia's appeared and pleaded for her release. The board was not moved. One prosecutor's response to the most recent hearing was blunt. She killed her father, she killed her mother, and she killed her brother. Those three acts together were described as, in his words, the hat trick of evil. That phrase, from a 2026 hearing, captured something the board has reflected in its repeated decisions: that some crimes carry a weight that does not diminish with the passage of time. Patricia Columbo is currently 69 years old. She remains incarcerated in the Illinois prison system. She is still eligible to continue seeking parole under the terms of her sentence, which runs to 300 years. Patricia Columbo wanted her family gone so she could live life on her own terms with a man her parents had told her she could not be with. She solicited that outcome for months, brought other people into the plan, handed them maps of her childhood home and photographs of the people inside it. And when no one else would carry it through, she did it herself. The inheritance never came. The relationship with DeLuca deteriorated inside prison walls, and the family she destroyed left behind no one to mourn them publicly. No grandchildren, no anniversaries. Just a case number and a courtroom that has reconvened more than 15 times and reached the same answer every time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes the next case just as difficult to process is that the daughter involved did not use weapons or accomplices from the street. She spent years building a perfect image as a devoted, high-achieving child before the entire construction collapsed in a single night in a quiet suburb of Toronto. Jennifer Pan. Jennifer Pan's parents believed they had done everything right. Han and Bik Ha Pan had arrived in Canada from Vietnam as refugees in 1979 with very little money and no established connections in a new country. They found work at an auto parts manufacturer in Ontario, saved carefully, and in 2004 purchased their own home in Markham, a quiet suburb northeast of Toronto. They had two children, Jennifer, born in 1986, and her younger brother Felix, born in 1989. By every visible measure, the family represented exactly the kind of story that people describe when they talk about immigrant families building something real from nothing. Jennifer was the centerpiece of that story, at least as her parents understood it. She was enrolled in competitive figure skating from a young age and trained seriously for years before an injury ended her competitive career as a teenager. She was presented by her parents as academically driven, obedient, and focused on a future in pharmacy. Han Pan, her father, was a man who kept detailed track of his daughter's progress. He expected high grades. He expected honesty. He expected the kind of discipline that had allowed him and his wife to build the life they had built. None of it was real. Jennifer Pan had been fabricating her academic life for years before anyone found out. She failed a prerequisite course in high school that would have allowed her to graduate with the grades her parents believed she had earned. Rather than tell them, she forged documents. She created fake report cards. She told her parents she had been accepted to the University of Toronto. She attended no classes. For years, she left the house each morning as though heading to university, went somewhere else, and returned home in the evening. She fabricated transcripts. She eventually told her parents she had been accepted to a pharmacy program. None of this existed. During the same period, Jennifer had been in a relationship with a young man named Daniel Wong, whom her parents did not approve of. He came from a different background. He was not the kind of person they had envisioned for their daughter. When they discovered the relationship, they ended it, or believed they had. Jennifer and Wong maintained contact in secret for years while she continued building her false academic life around her parents' expectations. The deception collapsed in 2010. Han and Bik Ha Pan found out, through a combination of confrontation and investigation, that their daughter had not attended university, had not enrolled in pharmacy school, and had been lying to them continuously for the better part of a decade. The response from Han Pan was severe. He imposed strict conditions on Jennifer's life inside the family home. Her freedom was sharply curtailed. She was required to be home by a specific time each evening. She was told she would not be permitted to see Daniel Wong. She was, in essence, treated as a teenager again, because in terms of her behaviour and honesty, that is what she had been operating as throughout her adult years. Jennifer Pan was 24 years old when these conditions were imposed. She had no university degree, no pharmacy career, no independent income. She was entirely dependent on parents who now knew she had been deceiving them for years, and who were responding by tightening their oversight of her daily life. What happened next was not an explosion of sudden rage. It was a plan. Jennifer reconnected with Daniel Wong, and the two of them began discussing a way to remove the people standing between them and the future they wanted. Jennifer had at some point calculated that her parents' estate, their home, their life insurance, their savings, amounted to approximately $500,000. She would inherit that money if they were gone. She and Wong began looking for someone to carry out the plan. The first attempt went nowhere. Jennifer approached a man and offered him $1,500 to confront her father. He declined and later told police about the conversation. Jennifer and Wong then went further. Wong connected Jennifer with a man named Lenford Crawford. Crawford brought in another man, Eric Caffey, who in turn brought in David Milvaganam. Jennifer paid an initial amount toward the agreed fee of $10,000, with the understanding that the remainder would come from the inheritance once the plan was completed. She also obtained a separate phone, a SIM card and handset provided by Wong, so that her communications with the men carrying out the plan could not be traced back to her regular phone number. On the evening of November 8, 2010, Bik Ha Pan came home from her weekly line dancing class. Han Pan had already gone to bed. Jennifer was in the house. She made a phone call on the secondary phone, and within a short time, 3 men entered the family home. They had firearms. What happened next was staged to look like a home invasion robbery. The men demanded money, moved the family, and then took Han and Bik Ha Pan to the basement. Both parents were shot multiple times. Bik Ha Pan passed away from her injuries. Han Pan was shot multiple times as well and survived, though the physical damage was permanent. He lost his sight as a result of his injuries and required extensive medical care. Jennifer Pan was found in the house, appearing to be a victim. She told police she had been tied up and threatened. She described the men as strangers who had forced their way in. She said she did not know why this had happened to her family. The investigation began to unravel her account almost immediately. Han Pan, despite his injuries, was conscious and able to speak to investigators during his recovery. He told them that he had seen Jennifer speaking quietly with one of the men, not as a terrified victim would speak to an armed stranger, but in the way a person speaks to someone they already know. That detail, from the man who had just lost his wife and his sight in the same evening, was the first crack in Jennifer's story. Investigators then obtained phone records. The secondary SIM card and phone that Jennifer had used to communicate with Crawford led them through a chain of connections that eventually reached Wong, Caffey, Crawford, and Milvaganam. Text messages between Wong and Jennifer included references to a plan, to a person Wong referred to as homeboy, and to the logistics of what had been arranged. Jennifer was brought in for multiple rounds of questioning. During those sessions, an investigator told her that police had access to technology capable of determining whether a person was being truthful during questioning. This is a legal technique in Canada. Police are permitted to misrepresent evidence or capabilities during interrogations. Jennifer, believing the investigator's claim, eventually broke during her third interview on November 22, 2010. She admitted that she had arranged for the men to come to the house. Among her first words after confessing was a question directed at the investigator. "But what happens to me?" Daniel Wong was arrested the same night. The others followed over the months that came after. The trial began in March 2014 and ran for nearly a year. All 5 defendants, Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, Eric Caffey, and David Milvaganam, faced charges. Caffey's case was separated from the main trial early on due to his lawyer's illness, and he later reached a separate agreement with prosecutors. The remaining 4 went through a full trial together, with each side presenting evidence over multiple months. The prosecution's case was built around the phone records, the financial motive, and the testimony of Han Pan. His account of seeing Jennifer speaking with one of the men at the scene was central to the argument that this was not a random home invasion, but a carefully arranged plan. The prosecution also presented evidence of Jennifer's previous attempt to recruit someone else for the same purpose, and the chain of introductions that connected her to the men ultimately hired. The defense for Jennifer argued that she had been driven to a breaking point by years of extreme parental pressure, a controlling home environment, and the collapse of a fabricated life she had built in response to expectations she could never honestly meet. Her attorneys argued that her mental state at the time of the arrangement should be taken into account. The jury convicted Jennifer Pan, Daniel Wong, Lenford Crawford, and David Milver Gannon of first-degree homicide and the attempted homicide of Han Pan on December 13, 2014. All four received life sentences with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Han Pan appeared at the sentencing and spoke publicly for the first time since the trial began. He said that in one night he had lost both his wife and his daughter. He later cut off all contact with Jennifer. His son Felix, Jennifer's younger brother, stayed out of the public eye entirely following the trial and has remained there. The case did not end with the 2014 conviction. In 2023, the Court of Appeal for Ontario reviewed the case and issued a ruling that created a new legal complication. The court found that the original trial judge had not properly allowed the jury to consider whether Han Pan, not Bic Ha Pan, had been the only intended target of the plan. The court's reasoning was that since Jennifer had waited until her mother was home before signalling for the men to enter, a jury should have been permitted to consider the possibility that Bic's passing was not part of the original plan. On that basis, the court overturned the first-degree homicide conviction related to Bic Ha Pan for Jennifer and her co-accused, while leaving the attempted homicide convictions related to Han Pan in place. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld that ruling in April 2025 in a 7-2 majority decision. The majority held that while evidence strongly supported the Crown's position that both parents were targets, no undisputed evidence directly contradicted the theory that only Han had been the intended target. The two dissenting justices argued that there was no realistic basis for that theory, specifically noting that Jennifer had waited until Bic was home before giving the signal. As a result of the Supreme Court ruling, Jennifer and her co-accused faced a new trial on the first-degree homicide charge related to Bic Ha Pan. In March 2026, Jennifer Pan pleaded guilty to manslaughter in connection with her mother's passing. She is currently serving a life sentence and is now eligible for parole, though no parole hearing outcome has been reported as of the time this script was written. The fundamental facts of what happened on November 8, 2010 have never been in serious dispute. Jennifer Pan arranged for armed men to enter her parents' home. Her mother passed away. Her father survived with permanent injuries. The legal process around the classification of the charge, first-degree homicide versus manslaughter, has shifted across multiple courts and years, but the underlying events are established and agreed upon. What the case revealed, beyond the events of that single night, was the full scope of the deception Jennifer had maintained for nearly a decade. The fabricated transcripts, the fake acceptance letters, the years of leaving the house each morning and going nowhere near a university. The parents who had built their lives around the belief that their daughter was achieving exactly what they had sacrificed to make possible for her, and who had no idea that the foundation of that belief was entirely invented. Han Pan recovered physically over time from his injuries, but never recovered what he lost. He no longer had a wife. He no longer had a daughter in any meaningful sense. He rebuilt a relationship with his son Felix, who had nothing to do with any of what happened, and the two of them continued their lives away from cameras and interviews. Jennifer Pan is currently in custody in Canada. The legal chapter connected to her mother's passing has been resolved through the 2026 guilty plea. The chapter connected to what she did to her father, a man who survived being shot multiple times in his own basement and then watched every legal proceeding from the aftermath, has no resolution that restores what was taken from him. She arranged all of this because her parents would not let her see her boyfriend, and because she did not want to be held accountable for years of lies. The $500,000 she expected to inherit never came. Daniel Wong, the person she had maintained the relationship with through years of secrecy, is serving a life sentence. The family home in Markham, where Bik Harpan came home from line dancing class on the last night of her life, was sold. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows this one involves a daughter who did not hire anyone and did not wait. She was 14 years old, she was in her own home in the middle of the afternoon, and what she did in the space of a few minutes was captured on the family's own surveillance cameras in footage that a jury watched in full during a 5-day trial. Erin Caffey. The Caffey family lived in Alba, Texas, a rural community in Rains County with a population of less than 500 people at the time. Terry Caffey worked as a home health aide and was training to become a minister. His wife Penny played piano at Miracle Faith Baptist Church, where the family worshipped regularly. Their 3 children, 16-year-old Erin, 13-year-old Matthew, and 8-year-old Tyler, had been homeschooled for 3 years on a Bible-based curriculum before being re-enrolled in public school 6 weeks before March 1, 2008. The family lived in a modest cabin set deep in the woods along a 1-lane gravel road outside town. Neighbours and church members described them as devoted, quiet, and deeply involved in their faith community. All of the Caffey children played instruments. Matthew, known to friends as Bubba, played harmonica. Tyler played guitar. Erin sang at church services with enough emotion that she sometimes broke into tears mid-song. Terry was working toward ministry. Penny anchored the family's musical presence at their church. By every account from people who knew them, this was a family that had built its daily life around faith, music, and each other. On the morning of March 1, 2008, Penny Caffey, Matthew Caffey, and Tyler Caffey were all gone. Terry Caffey was found outside the burning remains of the family cabin, having been shot 5 times. He was the only one who made it out. The person who arranged all of it was Erin. Erin had met Charlie Wilkinson in 2007 while working part-time as a car hop at the local Sonic restaurant. Wilkinson was 18 at the time, 2 years older than Erin. The two began a relationship quickly. Wilkinson gave Erin his grandmother's engagement ring as a promise ring. From the outside, it appeared to be a typical teenage romance. Penny Caffey discovered Wilkinson's MySpace page during the period when the relationship was forming and did not like what she saw. The page contained references to alcohol, profanity, and sexual content. In February 2008, after Erin broke the family's phone curfew, Terry and Penny told her the relationship with Wilkinson was over. She was not allowed to see him. The decision was firm. What her parents did not know was that Erin had already begun talking about a different kind of solution. Friends of Erin told Texas Monthly that within the same month her parents ended the relationship, Erin began expressing to people around her that she wanted her parents gone. Not that she was angry, not that she was upset, that she wanted them eliminated so she and Wilkinson could be together. A previous boyfriend of Erin's later told investigators that she had approached him before meeting Wilkinson and asked him to carry out the act against her family. He refused and ended the relationship. The plan that developed in the weeks before March 1st involved Wilkinson, his friend Charles Wade, who was 22, and Wade's girlfriend Bobby Johnson, who was close in age to Erin. According to Wilkinson's account given to investigators, he had initially suggested that Erin simply run away from home. Her response was that she did not want to run away. She wanted her parents gone permanently. Wilkinson also told investigators that he warned Erin ahead of time that if he went into the house, her younger brothers would need to be included because they were old enough to identify him afterward. According to the police interview audio, Erin's response to that warning was, "I don't care, just do what you gotta do." Phone records would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Between 11:46 p.m. on the night of February 29th and 12:48 a.m. on March 1st, Erin called Wilkinson 6 times from inside the Caffey family home. Those calls placed her in active communication with the person carrying out the plan during the window in which the attack occurred. Wilkinson and Wade entered the Caffey cabin while Erin and Bobby Johnson waited in a car parked down the road. Erin had left a door unlocked to allow them access. Inside the house, Terry and Penny were asleep in their bedroom. The two boys were asleep upstairs. Terry Caffey was shot multiple times in the bedroom and was left unable to move or speak. Penny was shot and then attacked further with a blade, suffering injuries that left her near decapitated. Matthew, 13 years old, was shot. Before he was shot, Terry Caffey heard his son call out from upstairs, "Charlie, Charlie, why are you doing this?" Tyler, 8 years old, was fatally stabbed. After the attack, the cabin was set on fire. Terry Caffey, despite having been shot 5 times, including wounds to his face, regained enough physical function to pull himself out of the burning building and get to a neighbour's house, where he collapsed. He survived. Rains County Sheriff's Deputy Charles Dickerson was the only officer on duty that night when the call came in just after 4:30 in the morning. When investigators arrived at the scene, the cabin was burning. The bodies of Penny, Matthew, and Tyler were inside. Terry was transported to a hospital in Tyler, Texas, where he told investigators from a gurney, struggling to breathe, believing he was going to die, that Charlie Wilkinson was his daughter's boyfriend and that he had seen Wilkinson in the room. Erin was not at the scene. When investigators went to locate her, she was with her grandparents, being transported toward the hospital to see her father. En route, a call came through informing the deputies accompanying her that Erin was now a suspect. She was handcuffed in the vehicle. She broke down in tears and told her grandparents she had nothing to do with what had happened to her family. Within 24 hours of the attack, all 4 people involved, Erin, Wilkinson, Wade, and Johnson, were in custody. The cabin was a smouldering ruin. All 4 immediately began speaking to investigators, and all 3 of the others placed Erin at the centre of the plan. The phone records confirmed Wilkinson's account in precise detail. Investigators could trace the 6 calls made between 11:46 p.m. and 12:48 a.m., demonstrating that Erin was in active contact with Wilkinson during the attack. The lead prosecutor on the case, District Attorney Stacey Tanner, later told Texas Monthly that when she saw the phone records, she knew the case against Erin was solid, regardless of what any of the other defendants said in testimony. The records alone established communication during the window of the attack. All 4 were charged with 3 counts of capital homicide. Prosecutors initially sought the maximum penalty for Wilkinson and Wade, but later agreed not to pursue it after Terry Caffey, Erin's father, the man who had been shot 5 times and watched his wife and 2 sons die, asked them not to. Terry Caffey said publicly that he did not want any more deaths. He wanted those responsible to have the chance to find genuine remorse. Erin was tried as an adult despite being 16 at the time of the attack. On January 2, 2009, she accepted a plea agreement and received 2 life sentences. Under Texas law and the terms of her agreement, she became eligible for parole consideration when she reaches 59 years of age. Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade each received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson, who did not enter the home and did not physically participate in the attack, received 40 years and became eligible for parole after serving 20 years. In 2016, Erin was interviewed by journalist Piers Morgan for a television documentary series. She was 24 at the time of filming, 8 years into her sentence. She told Morgan that she was shocked, angry, and hurt when her parents ended the relationship with Wilkinson. She described the plan they made as stupid. She said she could not believe that she had once wanted her family gone. When Morgan asked her directly how she felt sitting across from her father after he survived, she described seeing his arm in a sling for the first time and said it made everything real. She expressed remorse during that interview. Whether that remorse is genuine is a question the legal system has built directly into her sentence. She will not face parole consideration until she is nearly 60 years old, and any board that reviews her case will have access to the full record of what she arranged on the night of February 28th into March 1st, 2008. Terry Caffey's path after the attack is one of the more remarkable elements of a case filled with difficult details. He contemplated ending his own life in the immediate aftermath, by his own account. He eventually did not. He later remarried a woman named Karen and has 4 children with her, 1 biological and 3 adopted. He now ministers full-time, has visited more than 600 schools and more than 800 churches to speak about his experience, and wrote a book about the events titled Terror by Night. He has continued to visit Erin in prison. He has spoken publicly about his decision to forgive her, framing it not as a statement about what she did, but as something he needed to do in order to survive what happened to him. Matthew Caffey was 13 years old. Tyler Caffey was 8 years old. Penny Caffey was 37. The three of them were buried while their husband and father was still recovering from 5 gunshot wounds in a hospital bed. The home they had lived in was gone. The church where Penny played piano continued without her. Erin Caffey is currently incarcerated at the Hilltop Unit, a women's correctional facility in Gatesville, Texas. She has been inside the Texas prison system since 2009. She is in her early 30s. Under the terms of her sentence, she will not be eligible for parole review for several more decades. The case generated substantial national media coverage at the time of the trial and has continued to be referenced in discussions about juvenile violence and the role of romantic relationships in driving young people toward extreme behaviour. Investigators noted during and after the trial that the psychological evaluation conducted on Erin found no evidence of abuse within the Caffey household. There was no history of mistreatment, no documented trauma, no record of prior violence. Her court-mandated evaluation turned up nothing that explained her willingness to include her younger brothers in the plan. When Wilkinson told her that Matthew and Tyler would have to be included so there would be no witnesses, she said she did not care. That response, recorded in police interview audio and presented at trial, became the detail that prosecutors, journalists, and the public returned to most consistently when trying to understand the full weight of what Erin arranged. It is the detail that removes any reading of the situation as impulsive or unthinking. She knew, she was told directly, and she gave her answer. __quote_2___. The next case moves from rural Texas to a wealthy suburb of Sao Paulo, Brazil, where an 18-year-old from one of the most prominent families in the city unlocked the front door of her parents' mansion late at night and then went downstairs to wait while 2 men went up to her parents' bedroom. The name of that case has been known across Brazil for more than 2 decades, and the woman at the centre of it was released from prison in 2023 after serving 20 years. Suzanne von Richthofen. Manfred von Richthofen was a German-born engineer who had built a successful career in Brazil, managing major highway infrastructure projects for the Sao Paulo state government. His wife Mauricia was a Brazilian psychiatrist with a private practice. The two of them had raised their children in an upscale neighbourhood called Brooklyn in the south zone of Sao Paulo, in a large family home that neighbours described as well-kept and quietly impressive. They had 2 children, Suzanne, born in 1983, and her younger brother Andreas, born in 1987. The family was wealthy by any reasonable measure. Manfred's estimated net worth at the time of his passing was around $2 million, and prosecutors later raised the possibility that there were additional funds held in Swiss bank accounts opened in Suzanne's name when she turned 18, though this was never conclusively proven. The children attended the best private schools in Sao Paulo. Suzanne spoke 3 languages. She was enrolled as a law student at a respected university. From the outside, the family looked like everything a privileged upbringing in one of Brazil's most expensive cities was supposed to produce. Neighbours who had known the von Richthofens for years remembered them as a happy family. A psychologist who lived nearby and had known the couple for years described them warmly, calling them the happy family of the neighbourhood. They were not flashy people. Manfred was known for his work ethic and his sense of humour. Mauricia was quieter, more reserved. They had lived in the same area for the better part of 15 years. On the morning of November 1st, 2002, the day after Halloween, police received a call reporting a possible home invasion at the von Richthofen residence. When officers arrived, they found Manfred and Mauricia in their upstairs bedroom. Both had been struck with iron bars and strangled with towels. They had been attacked while they slept. The office downstairs had papers scattered across the floor. Some cash appeared to be missing. The alarm system was off. Suzanne and her younger brother Andreas were not in the house when police arrived. Suzanne had picked Andreas up earlier that morning, and the two had driven to the family home together, where Suzanne said they had discovered the scene. She reported the incident as a home invasion robbery. Investigators were skeptical almost immediately. The crime scene had details that did not match the story being presented. The alarm being disabled was one thing, but the scattered papers in the office were arranged in a way that looked deliberate rather than frantic. Too neat, too evenly spread, as though someone had placed them rather than thrown them. There were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had been inside the house had not broken in. They had been let in. What confirmed the investigators' suspicion faster than anything else was Suzanne's behaviour in the days that followed. The day after her parents were found, she was seen at the family home swimming in the pool with her boyfriend, Daniel Cravinhos, and within hours of her parents' burial, she celebrated her 19th birthday with a group of friends. Investigators watching the family noted these details carefully. The surveillance that followed led them to Daniel Cravinhos and his older brother Christian. Christian Cravinhos made the critical mistake that unravelled the entire plan. A few days after the incident, he paid cash for a motorcycle using high-denomination banknotes that were far beyond what his known financial situation could explain. On November 9th, 2002, 9 days after the incident, all three were arrested. Daniel and Christian Cravinhos and Suzanne von Richthofen were each brought in for questioning. All three confessed. What the confession and the subsequent investigation revealed was a plan that Suzanne had been developing for months. Suzanne had met Daniel Cravinhos in the summer of 1999 at a Brazilian jiu-jitsu class. They were 16 and 18 respectively at the time and began a relationship shortly afterward. The problem, from the beginning, was that Manfred and Maricia did not approve of Daniel. He came from a working-class background, which contrasted sharply with the world the von Richthofens occupied. He was not in school. He had no job. He used marijuana regularly. Manfred and Maricia saw him as someone entirely unsuited to their daughter's future and told her so repeatedly. Suzanne continued the relationship anyway, keeping much of it hidden from her parents. In July 2002, while Manfred and Maricia were away on vacation, she allowed Daniel to move into the family home. When her parents returned and found him there, the confrontation was significant. Maricia and Manfred made clear that Daniel was not welcome. Suzanne responded by asking her parents to buy her a separate apartment where she and Daniel could live together. Her father refused. He told her she was free to do whatever she chose, but only once she was earning her own money. That refusal appears to have been the point at which Suzanne's thinking shifted from conflict to planning. The plan she developed with Daniel and Christian Cravinhos was to stage a home invasion robbery at the family home. Suzanne would disable the alarm system, confirm her parents were asleep, and then open the door for Daniel and Christian. The brothers would go upstairs to the bedroom. Suzanne would remain downstairs. Afterward, the three of them would create alibis. Christian went to a fast food restaurant that evening, while Suzanne and Daniel spent the night at a motel. And in the morning, Suzanne would pick up her younger brother Andreas and return to the house to discover the scene. On the night of October 31st, 2002, the plan was carried out exactly as designed. Suzanne checked that her parents were asleep. She turned off the alarm. She opened the front door. Daniel and Christian went upstairs. Suzanne stayed in the living room below. The brothers attacked Manfred and Maricia with iron bars while they slept, and then used towels to strangle them. The entire attack took place while Suzanne stood one floor below, waiting. The next morning, she picked up Andreas from wherever he had been that night, drove to the house, and the two of them walked in together. Suzanne performed the role of a daughter who had just discovered something devastating. She called the police. She spoke to officers. She answered questions. She was swimming in the family pool with Daniel the following day. The trial did not begin until July 2006, nearly 4 years after the incident. The delay came from a combination of procedural complications, legal challenges, and a period during which Suzanne was actually released from custody on a Supreme Federal Court ruling granting her habeas corpus in 2005, meaning she spent time awaiting trial under house arrest rather than in detention. By the time the trial arrived, the relationship between Suzanne and Daniel Cravinhos had deteriorated completely. In court, Suzanne blamed Daniel for everything, characterizing herself as someone who had been manipulated and pressured by a controlling boyfriend. Daniel's defense took the opposite position, arguing that the entire plan had been Suzanne's idea and that he and his brother had acted on her direction. Christian Cravinhos similarly placed the origin of the plan with Suzanne. The prosecution rejected Suzanne's framing entirely. Chief Prosecutor Roberto Tardelli called her the mastermind of the crime and described her in terms that became widely quoted throughout Brazil's media coverage of the trial. He sought 50 years for each of the 3 defendants, the maximum available under the charges filed. The jury delivered its verdict on July 22, 2006. All 3 were convicted of homicidio qualificado, the Brazilian legal classification equivalent to first-degree homicide in other jurisdictions. The murders were classified as triply qualified under Brazilian law, meaning the crimes met 3 separate aggravating criteria. The methods used were considered cruel, the victims had no opportunity to defend themselves, and the motivation was deemed morally reprehensible. Suzanne von Richthofen and Daniel Cravinhos were each sentenced to 39 years and 6 months in prison. Christian Cravinhos received 38 years and 6 months, a slightly shorter term reflecting his somewhat lesser role in the planning. Under Brazilian law, regardless of the sentence handed down, no person can be imprisoned for longer than 30 years. That legal cap applied to all 3 of them. The public reaction in Brazil was enormous. The case had captured national attention from the moment the arrests were made, partly because of the family's social standing, and partly because of the striking contrast between the crime and the world it came from. A young woman from one of Sao Paulo's most privileged families, fluent in 3 languages, enrolled in law school, from a home worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and she had opened the door for the men who ended her parents' lives while they slept. Suzanne lost her right to inherit her parents' estate as a direct legal consequence of her conviction. The Swiss bank accounts that prosecutors had suggested might exist in her name were investigated twice, once in 2006 and again in 2015, and both investigations were closed without conclusive findings. Inside prison, Suzanne gave occasional paid interviews to Brazilian media, which generated ongoing public debate about whether she should have had the opportunity to profit in any way from her notoriety. She was later diagnosed with sociopathy, though this diagnosis came years after her conviction and had no bearing on the legal proceedings. Daniel Cravinhos reportedly expressed remorse over the years and gave few interviews. He reportedly married another woman while serving his sentence. His brother Christian was arrested again in 2018 for an unrelated matter and received an additional 4-year sentence. Suzanne progressed through different stages of her sentence over time. She moved to a semi-open prison regime in 2015, meaning she had more freedom within the facility and certain supervised access to activities outside it. On January 11, 2023, a Brazilian court granted her a transition to an open regime, meaning she was permitted to serve the remainder of her sentence outside of prison walls under specific court-mandated conditions. She was released from custody that year, having served 20 years of her original sentence. Her release was controversial. Brazilian media covered it extensively. People who remembered the case, and many did, because it had dominated national headlines for years, expressed strong views on both sides. Some argued that 20 years was a sufficient and proportionate consequence under the legal framework that applied to her sentence. Others pointed out that Manfred and Patricia von Richthofen had been attacked while they slept in their own home by men their daughter had let inside, and that no legal framework could fully account for what that meant. Manfred von Richthofen was 49 years old at the time of his passing. Patricia was also 49. Their younger son Andreas was 15 when he was brought to the family home the morning after the attack by the sister who had arranged it. He grew up in the years that followed without either of his parents and with the knowledge of how they had been taken. He has stayed almost entirely out of public view. The von Richthofen case remains one of the most discussed criminal cases in Brazilian history. It has been the subject of books, films, and documentary coverage in the 2 decades since the trial. Suzanne's name continues to appear in Brazilian media regularly, both in coverage of her life after release and in broader cultural discussions about the case itself. What she received from the plan she constructed was none of what she had expected. The inheritance was gone. The relationship with Daniel Cravinhos collapsed under the pressure of mutual blame during the trial. She spent 20 years inside the Brazilian prison system. Her brother grew up without parents. The family home, the neighbourhood, the life that Manfred and Patricia had built across decades of work, All of it was dismantled by the choices she made. She said during her trial that her motivation was love, that she feared Daniel would leave her if her parents remained alive and continued to oppose the relationship. The prosecutor's response to that framing was to note that love does not require a plan, an alibi, iron bars, and an unlocked door. What she described as love, he argued, was the desire to have what she wanted without accepting any obstacle between herself and it. Manfred and Patricia von Richthofen were the obstacle. On Halloween night 2002, she removed them. The case that follows this one takes place in England, and it involves a daughter who did not use a boyfriend, did not hire anyone, and did not move quickly. She spent months preparing, carried out the plan alone over 2 days, and then lived inside the same house with what she had done for 4 years before anyone came looking. When police finally broke the door down in September 2023, she told them to cheer up because at least they had caught the bad guy. Virginia McCullough. John McCullough was a retired business studies lecturer who had spent his career teaching at Anglia Ruskin University in Essex, England. His wife Lois was 71 years old, suffered from agoraphobia and traits of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and rarely left the house. The two of them had been married for decades and had 5 daughters together. By June 2019, all 4 of the older daughters had long since moved out, built their own lives, and were living independently. The youngest daughter, Virginia, born in October 1987, was still in the family home on Pump Hill in Great Baddow, a quiet residential area in Essex. Virginia was 31 years old in June 2019. She had no job and no regular income. She was not paying rent. Her parents had been supporting her financially for years, and Virginia had told them she was using that time to study and build a career as an artist, claiming the work would eventually become financially rewarding for the whole family. John and Lois believed her. They were elderly, both in poor health, and they depended on Virginia to help manage certain aspects of their household, including some of their financial arrangements. They trusted her with access to their accounts and their personal documents because she was living with them and because she was their daughter. That trust was the foundation Virginia built everything else on top of. The reality of Virginia's life during the years she was living rent-free in her parents' home looked nothing like what she had described to them. She was not building an art career. She was not saving money or investing in her future. She was spending. She had opened credit card accounts in her parents' names without their knowledge. She had taken out loans in their names. She had forged documents and created false paperwork to cover her tracks. She had told her parents that money they were missing had been lost to online scams, fabricating elaborate explanations each time the financial picture worsened. By June 2019, she had built up almost £60,000 worth of debt, all in her parents' names, all hidden from them through a sustained campaign of forgery and deception. She had also been gambling online, spending significant sums through betting platforms. The financial hole she had dug kept getting deeper, and Virginia understood that it was only a matter of time before John and Lois discovered the full extent of what she had done to them. Her sisters later described her to investigators as socially awkward and a compulsive liar. These were not descriptions formed in hindsight. The family had recognized something off about Virginia's relationship with truth for years. But recognizing that someone bends the truth and understanding that they are capable of what Virginia ultimately did are two entirely different things. None of her sisters anticipated the conclusion that was coming. Virginia began thinking about eliminating her parents in March 2019. This is not a reconstruction or an inference. It is what she told investigators herself after her arrest. She said she had started to feel trapped, that she wanted to be free of her parents and the situation she had created. The judge who sentenced her later addressed this reasoning directly, noting that the trap Virginia described was entirely of her own making. Her parents had not created the debt. They had not committed the fraud. She had. The walls she felt closing in were walls she had built herself, and rather than confess what she had done, she decided to remove the people who would eventually discover it. In the months between March and June 2019, Virginia accumulated a large quantity of prescription drugs. She obtained these gradually, stockpiling them over time. In May 2019, she purchased a knife and also bought equipment to crush medication into powder form. The level of preparation involved in these steps is not consistent with an impulsive decision made under emotional pressure. This was planned, sourced, and executed across multiple months. She had also, in the period before June 2019, been using her father as what the sentencing judge described as a guinea pig, giving him small amounts of medication to observe its effects before determining the dosage she would ultimately use. On the evening of June 17, 2019, Virginia prepared a cocktail of crushed prescription drugs and placed it in her parents' drinks. John McCullough drank his from an alcoholic beverage, which Virginia had used as the delivery method because he was a drinker and the taste would be masked. Lois McCullough did not drink alcohol. She consumed less of the drugged drink and did not receive a fatal amount. John was found dead in his bed the following morning. Lois was still alive. Virginia had anticipated this possibility and had prepared for it. She went into her mother's bedroom, where Lois was lying in bed listening to the radio, and she attacked her with a hammer and a knife. Lois McCullough, 71 years old, agoraphobic, dependent on her youngest daughter for basic support, was in her bed listening to the radio when Virginia ended her life. After the attack, Virginia left the house and walked to her local GP surgery to seek treatment for a cut she had sustained on her hand during the attack on her mother. She told the medical staff she had hurt herself. She gave no other information. She then returned home. Over the days and weeks that followed, Virginia dealt with the practical reality of what she had done. She placed her father's body under the bed in the ground floor study and then built a structure around it using breeze blocks, the kind of concrete blocks used in construction, along with sleeping bags and blankets. Her mother's body she wrapped in a sleeping bag and placed inside an upstairs wardrobe. She then closed the wardrobe. Virginia McCullough lived in that house for the next 4 years. She continued paying bills using her parents' accounts. She continued spending their pension payments. She continued using credit cards opened in their names. She continued gambling online. By the time she was arrested in September 2023, investigators established that she had claimed and spent approximately £150,000 belonging to her parents since their deaths, on top of the nearly £60,000 in debt she had already accumulated before the incident. The total financial damage to the estate ran well past £200,000. During those 4 years, she also maintained the pretense that John and Lois were alive. She cancelled medical appointments on their behalf, giving the GP surgery explanations for why they could not attend. She told family members and friends that her parents were unwell, or that they were away on extended trips, or that they were simply not up for visits at the moment. She cancelled family arrangements. She kept the curtains drawn. A neighbour who had lived next door for 2 decades later told reporters that the curtains were always closed and that you could never tell if anyone was home, and that Virginia had always come across as pleasant and funny, with a dark sense of humour. Her sisters have described the years of deception as systematic and relentless. One sister said to the court that Virginia always had an explanation, always claimed their parents were fine, and made up lie after lie about their daily activities. Another described their parents as completely blameless victims. The sisters had been kept at a distance through a combination of believable excuses and deliberate management of every potential point of contact between John and Lois and the outside world. The deception held, in part, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. During the lockdown periods of 2020 and 2021, the absence of John and Lois from any social or family activity was easy to explain. The prosecutor at Virginia's sentencing specifically noted that the pandemic restrictions had been, in her words, a stroke of luck for Virginia in pursuing the deception that her parents were still alive. The end came through medicine rather than family suspicion. In September 2023, the GP registered to John and Lois McCullough raised a concern with Essex County Council's safeguarding team. John had failed to collect a regular prescription and had missed scheduled appointments. The surgery had been receiving cancellations from Virginia for some time, and the pattern had eventually become impossible to explain away. The safeguarding team contacted Essex Police. Officers initially approached the situation as a missing persons investigation. They spoke to Virginia, who told them her parents were travelling and would be returning in October. The officers found her account unconvincing. On September 15, 2023, Essex Police executed a search warrant on the family home, forcing entry. Virginia was inside. She was arrested immediately, and almost immediately after being arrested, she told officers what had happened. The body cam footage captured her confession. She told the officers she had slipped something into her father's drink and placed his body under the bed on the ground floor. She told them her mother's body was in the wardrobe upstairs. She directed them to a knife she described as a murder weapon and mentioned a hammer she said would still have blood on it. And during this process, being handcuffed and led through a house where her parents had been concealed for 4 years, she told an officer to cheer up, because at least they had caught the bad guy. She then added that she knew she did not seem 100% evil. She was charged with 2 counts of homicide and appeared before magistrates on September 18, 2023. She was remanded in custody. The legal process that followed took just over a year. At a hearing on July 4, 2024, Virginia pleaded guilty to both counts of homicide at Chelmsford Crown Court. A sentencing hearing was scheduled and took place on October 11, 2024, presided over by Mr. Justice Johnson. At the sentencing, prosecutor Lisa Wilding KC described in detail how Virginia had built a makeshift structure around her father's body in the ground floor study, covering it with blankets and sleeping bags. She described how Lois had been stored in an upstairs wardrobe, also wrapped in a sleeping bag. She told the court that Virginia had been actively engaged in fraud and deception well before the events of June 2019, and that the homicides were carried out to prevent the discovery of that fraud. The judge addressed Virginia directly during the sentencing remarks. He told her that the trap she had described feeling was one she had constructed entirely through her own dishonest behaviour. He said that her parents were not responsible for the situation she found herself in. She was. He described her as having maintained an elaborate, extensive, and enduring web of deceit over months and years. He confirmed that he was certain there had been a substantial degree of premeditation and planning involved in both homicides. Mr. Justice Johnson sentenced Virginia McCullough to life in prison, with a minimum term of 36 years before she becomes eligible for parole consideration. She was 36 years old at the time of sentencing. Virginia's defense attorney told the court that Virginia understood she had damaged her siblings to an extent they were unlikely to recover from. She also told the court that Virginia had said she was a happier person in prison than she had been outside. Whether that was meant as an expression of relief at no longer maintaining the deception, or as something else, was not elaborated on. The family of John and Lois McCullough issued a joint statement following the sentencing. They described being devastated and heartbroken at the loss of their parents, who they said had been taken from them so cruelly. They said their parents had loved trips to the seaside together and had enjoyed many walks and visits to different attractions. They said their mother and father were forever in their hearts and were loved and missed beyond any measure. John McCullough was 70 years old when Virginia placed medication in his drink on the evening of June 17, 2019. Lois was 71. Both were in poor health. Both relied on the daughter living with them. Both had been systematically defrauded by that daughter for years before she made the decision to ensure they could never find out how far it had gone. John's body remained in the ground floor study of the family home for 4 years. Lois's body remained in the wardrobe upstairs. The curtains were kept closed. The neighbours saw Virginia come and go. The GP surgeries received cancellations. The pension payments kept moving into accounts Virginia was spending, and not one person on the outside knew. A Channel 5 documentary titled "Killed by Our Daughter: The Virginia McCullough Murders" aired in the United Kingdom in November 2024, 1 month after the sentencing. It drew significant viewership and renewed public discussion about the case across British media. Virginia McCullough is currently serving her sentence in the British prison system. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until she has served a minimum of 36 years, meaning she would be in her early 70s before any board reviews her case. Quote, _4, __. The next case shifts from England to a small town in Mississippi, where in March 2024, a 14-year-old girl was caught on her own family's surveillance cameras pacing through the house with a firearm behind her back, and what followed in the next hour was captured on that same footage from beginning to end. Carly Madison Gregg Ashley Smiley was a 40-year-old high school math teacher in Brandon, Mississippi. She had built a life in Rankin County with her husband Heath Smiley, a physical therapist whose clinic was approximately 5 minutes from their home. Heath had a daughter from Ashley's previous relationship named Carly Madison Gregg, and by all accounts from the people who knew the family, the household functioned like a normal one. Heath described Carly on the witness stand as mostly a sweet little girl to him and to her mother. He said the emotion he and Ashley were most concerned about when it came to Carly was sadness. She would get emotional at times, he told the court. She was a teenage girl going through things that teenage girls go through. Ashley had enrolled Carly in therapy and had taken her to a clinic in Madison to speak with a professional about what she was experiencing. A therapist had placed Carly on medication for anxiety and depression. The family had also tried equine-assisted therapy, which uses interaction with horses as part of a mental health treatment approach. These were not the actions of a household ignoring a struggling child. These were active attempts to get Carly help. Carly had a history of getting into trouble at school. She had previously brought a Swiss Army knife onto school grounds, which resulted in her being transferred to a different school. Heath testified that Carly's history with substances may have been influenced by her biological father, Kevin Gregg, who had a documented history of drug use. Kevin Gregg was not part of Carly's daily life. Heath was the man in the house, the one who drove her places and talked to her, and, by his own account, spoke with her every day, even after everything that happened. 1 week before March 19, 2024, Carly's doctors switched her to a new medication. Her defense team would later argue that this change contributed to a deterioration in her mental state, pointing to reported symptoms including dissociation, auditory hallucinations, and severe mood instability in the days that followed the switch. A friend who was close to Carly testified that in the days leading up to March 19th, he had developed serious concerns about her well-being. He said she had told him she was hearing voices. March 19, 2024 began as a normal Tuesday. Heath left for work. Ashley went about her day. Carly was at home. At some point during the mid-afternoon, a student at the high school where Ashley taught, and a friend of Carly's, made a decision that likely saved Heath Smiley's life, and permanently altered the trajectory of everything that came after. That student contacted Ashley and told her that Carly had a significant quantity of cannabis hidden in her bedroom. Along with the cannabis, the student indicated there were also e-cigarettes and burner phones concealed in the room. Ashley went home. She found the items. She confronted Carly. Whatever was said between Ashley and Carly in that confrontation is not fully known from the public record. What is known is what the family's own surveillance system captured in the hours that followed. The footage showed Carly moving through the house with a firearm held behind her back. She paced. She moved from room to room. The gun she was carrying was a .357 Magnum revolver that Ashley kept stored in a compartment beneath her side of the bed. Ashley kept it there because she was, according to Heath's testimony, genuinely frightened of Carly's biological father and wanted to have access to protection. Carly had never shown any interest in the firearms kept in the house, Heath said. He and Ashley had even invited her to join them on shooting outings, and she had always declined. The surveillance audio captured the sound of gunfire. Then Carly walked back into the kitchen. She put the firearm down. She picked up her phone and began texting. She played with the family dogs. Prosecutors told the court that Carly had fired 3 rounds at her mother Ashley at close range. Ashley Smiley, 40 years old, a high school math teacher who had spent the past several years trying to get her daughter professional help, was gone. Carly then contacted a friend, identified throughout the trial proceedings only as BW, to protect the minor's identity. She sent BW a message saying she had an emergency and needed her to come over. When BW arrived at the house, Carly asked her a question. She asked if BW had ever seen a body before. BW said no. Carly then showed her Ashley's body. Carly told BW to go outside and wait. She explained that her stepfather was going to be coming home soon and that she needed to take care of something. She then picked up Ashley's phone and used it to send Heath a text message. The message read, "When will you be home, honey?" Heath, receiving what he believed was a message from his wife, responded and made his way home from the clinic 5 minutes away. When Heath arrived and opened the door, Carly was on the other side of it with the firearm. She fired. The round struck Heath in the shoulder. He described the moment on the witness stand by saying the gun went off in his face before the door was fully open. He also said that when he looked at Carly in that moment, she looked like she had seen a demon or something. He said he was not certain she even recognised him. Heath Smiley wrestled the firearm away from his stepdaughter. He made it to a phone and called 911. The recording of that call was played for the jury during the trial. On it, Heath can be heard screaming that his stepdaughter had shot him and that she had shot his wife. Carly fled the house. BW, who had been waiting outside, heard the shots and saw Carly run out. Law enforcement responded and located Carly in a field approximately half a mile from the family home. She was taken into custody. When she was booked into the Rankin County Jail, she tested positive for cannabis. She admitted to investigators that she had smoked cannabis the day before the incident. The Rankin County District Attorney's Office made the decision to charge Carly as an adult. She was indicted in May 2024 on charges of first-degree homicide, attempted homicide, and tampering with evidence. The tampering with evidence charge related to her use of Ashley's phone to send the message to Heath, designed to bring him back to the house. She was 14 years old at the time of the incident and 15 by the time the trial began. Efforts by Carly's defence team to have the case moved to youth court were rejected by the presiding judge, Dewey Arthur. Efforts to exclude the public and media from the courtroom were also rejected. The judge cited established Mississippi legal precedent supporting open proceedings and ruled that the trial would be public and fair. The prosecution's case was built on the surveillance footage, the 911 call, Heath Smiley's testimony, BW's testimony, and the evidence of what Carly had done in the period between shooting Ashley and Heath's arrival home. The sequence of events, the text sent from Ashley's phone, the instruction to BW to wait outside because something needed to be handled, the positioning at the door when Heath arrived, formed the foundation of the prosecution's argument that Carly understood what she was doing and had taken deliberate steps to continue and cover it. Prosecutor Catherine Newman addressed this directly during the trial. She told the jury that Carly had stated, in the period after shooting Ashley and before Heath's arrival, that she had put 3 into her mother and had 3 more waiting for her stepfather. Newman asked the jury whether that sounded like someone who did not know what was happening around her. The defence presented a different account of Carly's mental state. Her attorneys argued she had been experiencing a severe psychiatric episode at the time of the incident, pointing to her history of depression and anxiety, the medication change 1 week prior, the reported auditory hallucinations, and testimony from a psychiatrist named Dr. Andrew Clark, who told the court that Carly had no memory whatsoever of what had occurred. The defence's formal position was not guilty by reason of insanity, asking the jury to find that Carly had not understood the nature of her actions at the time she took them. The prosecution countered by presenting the sequence of events as evidence of functional awareness. Dr. Jason Pickett and Dr. Amanda Gugliano, who had evaluated Carly using Mississippi's legal standards for assessing mental state, both concurred under cross-examination that Carly had taken steps during and after the shooting that demonstrated awareness of her circumstances. The deliberate use of Ashley's phone, the communication with BW, the instruction to wait outside. These were not the actions of someone entirely disconnected from reality. Dr. Clark, Carly's own psychiatric witness, was asked directly during cross-examination whether Carly had taken steps to conceal what she had done. He acknowledged that she had. The prosecution also pointed to the fact that Carly had voluntarily used cannabis the day before the incident, and that she tested positive for it at the time of her arrest. The argument was that voluntary substance use prior to the events of March 19th could not be used as a foundation for an insanity defense. The defense had also been the subject of significant procedural criticism during the lead-up to the trial. Judge Arthur publicly expressed frustration with Carly's legal team on multiple occasions, citing failures to submit required documentation on time and finding that the defense had provided only minimal information to the prosecution during the discovery process. He ruled that one of the defense's planned witnesses would not be permitted to testify as a direct consequence of these failures, and placed restrictions on the nature of other witness testimonies. Despite attempting to dress Carly in schoolgirl clothing throughout the proceedings, a choice noted by observers as a visible attempt to preserve an impression of youth and innocence, the defense was unable to overcome the weight of what the surveillance footage showed, what Heath Smiley described, what BW testified to, and what Carly had said during the window between the 2 shootings. Carly had also rejected a plea agreement offered by prosecutors before the trial began. That agreement would have resulted in a 40-year prison sentence, she turned it down. The jury began deliberating on September 20th, 2024. They returned a verdict in approximately 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree homicide, attempted homicide, and tampering with evidence. The sentencing phase followed immediately. The jury took less than an hour to return a sentencing recommendation. Judge Arthur imposed the sentence without delay. Carly Madison Gregg was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the homicide conviction. She received an additional life sentence for the attempted homicide of Heath Smiley, with the 2 life terms to run concurrently. She also received 10 years for the evidence tampering charge, to run consecutively to the life terms. Rankin County District Attorney Bubba Bramlett spoke to the media after the verdict. He said that Carly Gregg is evil, and acknowledged that this was not easy to say, but added that sometimes evil comes in young packages. Heath Smiley had asked that the no-contact order between himself and Carly be lifted after her arrest. He told the court that he and Carly had been speaking by phone and video call regularly while she was held at the Rankin County Jail awaiting trial. He said their conversations were mostly just normal. He said he thought they were in a good place. Heath Smiley, a man who had survived being shot in the face when he opened his own front door, was still calling the person who shot him. That detail alone says something about the kind of person Heath Smiley is. Ashley Smiley was 40 years old. She had spent years trying to get her daughter help: therapy, medication, equine-assisted programs, clinical consultations. The firearm she kept under her side of the bed was there because she was afraid of someone else. Carly found it, carried it through the house on the family's own surveillance system, and used it against the person who had been trying to help her. The defense announced plans to appeal the conviction and sentence. In February 2026, a group called Carly's Warriors, organized and run by members of Carly's family, was registered with the Mississippi Secretary of State's office. The group's stated position is that the sentence was disproportionate given Carly's age and her mental health history at the time of the incident. An appeal to the Mississippi Supreme Court was filed and remained pending as of the time this script was researched. Carly Madison Gregg is currently serving her sentence in the Mississippi Correctional System. She was 15 years old when she was sentenced. She will spend the rest of her natural life in prison unless an appeal succeeds in changing the outcome. The case that follows this one also involves a teenager, but the setting is completely different. It takes place in a rural community in Idaho in 2003, involves a 16-year-old girl, and the evidence that ultimately convicted her was found in a garbage can outside the family home, inches away from being permanently lost when investigators stopped the collection truck just in time. Sarah Johnson. Alan and Diane Johnson lived in Bellevue, Idaho, a small community in Blaine County in the south-central part of the state. Alan was 46 years old, Diane was 52. They had 2 children, a son named Matt and a 16-year-old daughter named Sarah. Bellevue sits in the Wood River Valley, a rural area where most people know their neighbours and where the kind of violent crime that arrived on September 2, 2003 was genuinely outside the experience of the community. The Johnsons were not a prominent family in the way that draws public attention before a tragedy. They were an ordinary household in a small town. Alan and Diane had raised their children in Blaine County, and by the accounts of family members who spoke during and after the trial, they were parents who were engaged in their children's lives and who set rules they expected to be followed. Those rules became the source of the conflict that prosecutors argued ultimately led to their deaths. Sarah Johnson had been in a relationship with a man named Bruno Santos. Santos was significantly older than Sarah, and he was not in the country legally. When Alan and Diane Johnson discovered the relationship, they moved to end it. They told Sarah the relationship was not acceptable and took steps to enforce that position, including threats to contact immigration authorities regarding Santos's status in the United States. Santos was eventually deported following the incident, though he later returned to the country to testify at Sarah's trial. The conflict between Sarah and her parents over Santos had been ongoing in the period leading up to September 2, 2003. A cellmate who later testified at trial said Sarah had spoken openly while in custody about the fights she had with her mother, describing them as knockdown, drag-out arguments. The same witness said Sarah had described her mother as someone who favoured her brother Matt and would give him anything. She also reportedly told this witness that her father had changed a life insurance policy and that she stood to receive everything because her brother was not actually her father's biological child. Whether this was true or fabricated is not established in the court record, but the fact that Sarah was discussing it with a fellow inmate speaks to where her mind was focused during that period. On the morning of September 2nd, 2003, Alan and Diane Johnson were in their home in Bellevue. Diane was asleep in the master bedroom. Alan had gotten up and was in the bathroom taking a shower. Sarah was also in the house. Diane Johnson was shot once in the head while she lay sleeping in the master bedroom. Alan Johnson was shot twice in the chest as he came out of the shower. Both wounds were fatal. The firearm used was a .264 caliber rifle. Sarah's account to investigators was that she had been asleep in her own bedroom when she heard gunshots. She said she got up, went toward her parents' room, heard a second shot, became frightened, and ran out of the house to a neighbour's property, where she called emergency services. She described an intruder. She maintained from the moment of her first conversation with investigators that someone else had entered the house and attacked her parents, and that she had no involvement in what happened. She has never changed that position. She maintained it through her arrest, through a 6-week trial, through sentencing, through multiple rounds of appeals, and through her ongoing incarceration. Sarah Johnson has consistently said she did not do this. The physical evidence told a different story, and it was the physical evidence that the prosecution built its case around. Investigators processing the scene found a latex glove in the garbage can positioned in front of the Johnson home. The garbage collection service had already been called and was in the process of making its rounds in the neighbourhood. Officers stopped the truck before it reached the Johnson property and recovered the contents of the can before they could be taken away and lost. Inside that can, along with the latex glove, was a discarded bathrobe. Both items were sent for forensic analysis. The results were significant. DNA recovered from the latex glove matched both Alan Johnson and Diane Johnson. DNA from the bathrobe also matched both victims. Sarah Johnson's DNA was present on both items as well. Also found in the garbage can was a leather glove. This glove had gunshot residue on it. Investigators found a second leather glove inside Sarah's bedroom, the matching glove from the same pair. The pair of gloves was ordinarily kept in Diane Johnson's vehicle. Bloody ammunition was recovered from Sarah's bedroom. The combination of these items, a glove with the victim's DNA and Sarah's DNA in the trash, a matching glove with gunshot residue found in Sarah's room, and ammunition from the same location, formed the physical core of the prosecution's case. Investigators did not find evidence of a forced entry consistent with an outside intruder having come into the home. The picture the evidence painted was of someone who had been inside the house, who had taken precautions to avoid leaving traces, and who had attempted to dispose of the materials used. The trial began in early 2005, following Sarah's arrest in late October 2003, and ran for approximately 6 weeks. The proceedings were moved from Blaine County to Boise after the presiding judge ruled that finding unbiased jurors in the local community was not realistically possible given the level of attention the case had received. The trial cost Blaine County more than $1 million. The prosecution presented the physical evidence, the testimony of the former cellmate, who described Sarah's conversations about her parents and the insurance policy, and the account of Bruno Santos, who had returned to the country specifically to testify. The prosecution argued that Sarah had been motivated by the conflict over her relationship with Santos and by the financial dimensions of what would follow her parents' deaths. The defense challenged the forensic evidence and presented an alternative theory. Sarah's legal team argued that a man named Christopher Hill, who had been renting the guest house on the Johnson property at the time of the incident, was a more plausible suspect. Hill was a friend of a person connected to the property and had access to the grounds. The defense pointed to the fact that fingerprints found on the murder weapon, the rifle scope, and an ammunition box had been identified as belonging to Hill. This was the central piece of what the defense characterized as newly discovered evidence in later appeals. The prosecution's response was that Hill's fingerprints on those items did not place him at the scene during the shooting, did not contradict the forensic evidence connecting Sarah to the scene, and did not provide a credible alternative explanation for the DNA recovered from the garbage can or for the gunshot residue on the glove found in Sarah's bedroom. The prosecution argued that the presence of Hill's prints on the weapon could be explained by prior handling of the rifle that had nothing to do with the morning of September 2, 2003. Sarah's account that she had heard the shots, started toward her parents' room, and then fled after a second shot also presented internal inconsistencies that investigators noted from the beginning. She gave multiple versions of the sequence of events in her initial conversations with police, changing details about what she had heard, when she had moved through the house, and what she had seen before she left. These inconsistencies did not establish guilt on their own, but they undermined her credibility as a witness to her own account of events. The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours across 3 days. On March 16, 2005, they returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree homicide. Blaine County Prosecutor Jim Thomas told reporters after the verdict that he would be seeking 2 consecutive life sentences and that the level of premeditation involved and the nature of the crimes fully justified that outcome. Sarah Johnson was 18 years old at the time of the verdict, having turned 17 during the period between her arrest and the trial. The sentencing hearing was held on July 7, 2005, before 5th District Judge Barry Wood. At the hearing, Judge Wood addressed Sarah directly. He told her that if the case had been eligible for the highest available penalty under Idaho law, she would have been a candidate for it. The fact that her age at the time of the offence made her ineligible for that outcome was the only reason the sentence did not go further than it did. He sentenced Sarah Johnson to 2 fixed life terms in prison, 1 for each count of first-degree homicide, to be served concurrently, plus a 15-year firearms enhancement under Idaho Code Section 19-2520 to be served consecutively to the life terms. Pat Dishman, Diane Johnson's mother and Sarah's maternal grandmother, spoke outside the courthouse after the sentencing. She said it was bittersweet, but that it was a just decision. She added that it was very hard, and that the family loved Sarah too. That last sentence, that the family loved Sarah too, captures something about how these cases land for the people surrounding them. The victim's family and the perpetrator's family are often the same people. The loss does not divide neatly. Sarah was transferred to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho, where she remains incarcerated today. The appeals process began almost immediately after sentencing and has continued for 2 decades. The first direct appeal was dismissed because Sarah's attorneys at the time failed to file a timely notice of appeal, a failure the courts later classified as ineffective assistance of counsel. That finding allowed the judgment of conviction to be re-entered and gave Sarah the opportunity to file a new direct appeal on proper footing. On direct appeal, the Idaho Supreme Court affirmed the conviction in 2008. In 2012, Sarah's legal team filed a petition for post-conviction relief, supported by pro bono counsel. The petition raised 2 primary arguments. The first was that the identification of Christopher Hill's fingerprints on the murder weapon constituted newly discovered evidence that entitled her to a new trial. The second was that her original trial counsel had been ineffective in multiple respects that had prejudiced the outcome of her case. The district court rejected both arguments. The Idaho Supreme Court reviewed the matter and issued its ruling in 2014, affirming the district court's decisions. On the fingerprint question, the court found that Hill's identified prints did not make it more probable than not that Sarah was innocent, because the prints did not establish that Hill had been present in the house on the morning of September 2, 2003, and did not contradict the forensic evidence placing Sarah at the scene. In 2017, Sarah filed a further appeal, arguing that her 2 fixed life sentences violated the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, in light of United States Supreme Court rulings in Miller v. Alabama and Montgomery v. Louisiana. Those rulings had established that mandatory life sentences for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional and that courts must consider the youth of the offender as a mitigating factor before imposing such a sentence. The Idaho Supreme Court addressed this argument directly. In a unanimous ruling, the court acknowledged that the holdings in Miller and Montgomery applied to Idaho. However, the court found that those rulings had been complied with in Sarah's case because the sentencing judge had held a hearing specifically considering her youth and the developmental characteristics of adolescent offenders before imposing the sentence, and had made specific references to her age during the sentencing proceedings. Because the constitutional requirement that youth be considered before a life sentence is imposed on a juvenile had been met in her case, the appeal did not succeed. The Idaho Innocence Project has worked on Sarah's behalf and has argued that she did not receive competent representation and that new DNA testing techniques applied to the evidence from the scene could potentially produce results that support her innocence claim. The Idaho Supreme Court found in 2014 that additional DNA testing would not make it more probable than not that Sarah was innocent, and declined to grant the request. Sarah Johnson is currently 38 years old. She is incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho, where she has been held since her sentencing in 2005. Her inmate identification number is 77613. She continues to maintain that she did not harm her parents. The physical evidence that convicted her, the glove with 2 victims' DNA and her own DNA, recovered from a garbage can that was minutes away from being permanently removed by a collection truck, the matching glove with gunshot residue found in her bedroom, the ammunition recovered from the same location, has been examined across multiple levels of appeal and found sufficient to support the verdict on each occasion. Alan Johnson was 46 years old. Diane Johnson was 52. They were both shot inside their own home on a Tuesday morning in a small Idaho town. Their daughter Matt has remained out of the public eye throughout the 2 decades since. Their extended family has lived with the outcome of that morning for just as long. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The case that follows takes place in Canada and involves the youngest perpetrator in this entire collection, a girl who was 12 years old when she and her 23-year-old boyfriend carried out a plan she had put into writing in an email weeks before it happened, and whose criminal record was legally expunged in 2020, meaning she is currently living freely somewhere in Canada under a name and identity the public is not permitted to know. Jasmine Richardson Medicine Hat is a city in Alberta, Canada, with a population of around 60,000 people. It sits in the southeastern corner of the province, surrounded by flat prairie land, and it is the kind of place where violent crime involving children is so far outside normal experience that when it happens, the entire community has difficulty processing it. The Richardson family had lived there for years. Mark Richardson was 42 years old and worked a steady job. His wife, Deborah, was 48. Their son, Tyler Jacob, known to his friends by his middle name, was 8 years old and in elementary school. Their daughter, Jasmine, was 12. By the accounts of people who knew the family before April 2006, the Richardsons were unremarkable in the best sense of that word. Mark and Deborah were described as recovering from past personal struggles, having met at a gymnasium in Sudbury years earlier and built a life together. They had 2 children who were 5 years apart. Jasmine had been described by teachers and family as a happy, social girl who was generally well liked before her early teenage years brought changes that her parents found increasingly difficult to manage. The changes that came when Jasmine entered her early teens were the kind that many parents encounter: shifting interests, new social circles, a gravitational pull toward things that worried the adults in her life. She became interested in Gothic culture and online communities organised around shared interests in darker aesthetics and alternative identities. Mark and Deborah responded to these changes by applying stricter rules, which Jasmine experienced as suffocating and unfair. She attempted on multiple occasions to have herself placed in foster care rather than continue living under her parents' oversight. Those attempts went nowhere. The person who changed everything entered Jasmine's life at a punk rock concert in early 2006. Jeremy Steinke was 23 years old when he met Jasmine Richardson. He described himself publicly as a 300-year-old werewolf. He wore a small vial around his neck that he claimed contained blood. He maintained a profile on a website called vampirefreaks.com, a social networking platform organised around Gothic and horror subcultures that was popular in the mid-2000s. Jasmine also had a profile on the same platform, and the two maintained contact through it, as well as through direct communication after meeting in person. Steinke did not know Jasmine's real age when they met, according to his own account. He knew she was young. He knew she was significantly younger than him. The age gap between a 23-year-old man and a 12-year-old girl is not something that requires precise knowledge of a birth date to recognise, and this was noted repeatedly in coverage of the case, and in the legal proceedings that followed. When Mark and Deborah Richardson found out about the relationship, they did what parents in their position do. They shut it down. Jasmine was forbidden from seeing Steinke. She was grounded. She was monitored. The rules in the household tightened in direct response to what her parents had discovered. For Jasmine, the response to being told she could not see Steinke was not to accept it. It was to begin planning a way around it. The planning was not kept entirely private. Jasmine spoke to friends about wanting her parents gone. She made statements that those around her later described as frightening in hindsight, but that were not taken seriously at the time as genuine intentions. People who heard her say these things assumed it was the expression of a frustrated teenager, rather than an actual plan taking shape. It was an actual plan taking shape. The email that Jasmine sent to Steinke in the weeks before April 23, 2006, was one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. In it, she described her intentions in direct terms. She wrote that it begins with me eliminating them and ends with me living with you. Steinke's response did not reject the idea. He wrote back that he loved her plan, but that they needed to get a little more creative with the details. Steinke also posted on his blogging platform during this period. On April 3, 2006, approximately 3 weeks before the incident, he wrote publicly about Jasmine's parents, stating that their throats he wanted to cut, and that their blood would be payment for what they had done in keeping the two of them apart. These posts were publicly accessible at the time and were recovered by investigators afterward. The night before April 23rd, Jasmine and Steinke watched a film together. The film was Natural Born Killers, Oliver Stone's 1994 movie about two young people who go on a violent rampage across the American Midwest. Steinke later told an undercover police officer that the film had been part of what motivated him, alongside Jasmine's plan. On the night of April 23, 2006, Jeremy Steinke arrived at the Richardson family home in Medicine Hat. He entered wearing a neoprene mask and carrying a knife. Mark and Deborah Richardson were downstairs. Steinke encountered Deborah first and attacked her, stabbing her multiple times. Mark Richardson heard his wife and came to find out what was happening. He attempted to fight back using a screwdriver. Steinke overpowered him and stabbed him multiple times as well. According to accounts from the investigation, Mark Richardson asked Steinke why he was doing this. Steinke's reported response was that it was what their daughter wanted. Tyler Jacob Richardson was 8 years old and was upstairs in his bedroom. What happened next has been the subject of slightly different accounts from Jasmine and Steinke, each of whom offered different versions of who did what to Tyler. Steinke's account, given to investigators, was that he stood in the doorway of Tyler's room and that Jasmine was the one who attacked her brother. Jasmine's account, given during the trial, was that Steinke had ordered her to do it, and that she did not want to leave Tyler without parents. Both accounts agree that Tyler was attacked, and that Steinke finished the assault by cutting the boy's throat. Tyler Jacob Richardson, 8 years old, did not survive. After the 3 members of the Richardson family were gone, Jasmine and Steinke left the house together. What they did immediately afterward is one of the details that has remained embedded in public memory of this case. Within approximately 2 hours of leaving the house where her parents and brother had just been killed, Jasmine and Steinke were at a party. Witnesses at the party later told investigators that the two were kissing so intensely that it made other guests uncomfortable. Steinke had a black eye. Nobody at the party knew yet what had happened on the street where the Richardson family lived. The following morning, a 6-year-old boy arrived at the Richardson home to play with Tyler Jacob, his friend. He looked through a ground floor window and saw what appeared to be bodies. He ran home and told his mother. She called police. When officers arrived and entered the house, they found Mark and Deborah in the basement and Tyler upstairs in his bedroom. The family's 12-year-old daughter was not present. Initial concern was that she had been taken. The community response in Medicine Hat was immediate and anxious. The possibility that a child from the family had survived and been abducted while the rest of her family was killed generated exactly the kind of fear that small communities feel acutely. That concern shifted rapidly once investigators began processing what they found. Inside Jasmine's school locker, a guidance counsellor discovered a hand-drawn comic. The comic depicted a girl setting her family home on fire while her family was inside, then leaving the burning house with her boyfriend. the discovery changed the nature of the investigation entirely. Digital evidence followed quickly. The emails between Jasmine and Steinke were recovered. Steinke's blog posts were retrieved. The vampirefreaks.com communications were examined. Investigators tracked the two through their digital footprint to the community of Leader, Saskatchewan, approximately 130 kilometers from Medicine Hat, where Jasmine and Steinke had fled in the truck belonging to a friend of Steinke's, named Casey Lancaster. On April 24, 2006, one day after the incident, both Jasmine Richardson and Jeremy Steinke were located at a convenience store in Leader and taken into custody by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Lancaster was later charged with being an accessory and with disposing of evidence, pleaded guilty in provincial court, and received 1 year of house arrest, along with conditions prohibiting drug and alcohol use. While in custody awaiting their respective trials, Steinke sent Jasmine letters from his cell, proposing marriage. She accepted. The correspondence between them from custody was later reviewed as part of the investigation into the full scope of their communications. When investigators placed an undercover officer near Steinke in custody, Steinke spoke openly about what had happened. He confirmed that the plan had originated with Jasmine and acknowledged that he had been influenced by natural-born killers. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree homicide and went to trial as an adult. Jasmine was 12 at the time of the incident and 13 by the time she was charged. Under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, she could not be tried as an adult. She was identified throughout the legal process only as JR, consistent with the protections the Act extends to young offenders. She pleaded not guilty at her trial in June 2007, which took place when she was 14. She told the court that the conversation she had about eliminating her family had been hypothetical and that she had never intended for any of it to actually happen. The jury did not accept this account. On July 9, 2007, Jasmine Richardson was found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree homicide. She became the youngest person in Canadian history to be convicted on multiple counts of first-degree homicide. The sentencing took place on November 8, 2007. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, the maximum sentence available for a person who was under 14 at the time of the offence is 10 years. Judge B.R. Miller imposed that maximum. The sentence structure included 4 years in a psychiatric institution, followed by a period of conditional supervision in the community. Jasmine received credit for the 18 months she had already spent in custody since her arrest. Jeremy Steinke was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree homicide in 2008, following his separate adult trial. He was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences in prison, with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. He has since legally changed his name to Jackson May and has remained in the Canadian federal prison system. An appeal against his sentence was filed and failed. Jasmine's path through her sentence was tracked carefully by the court and by mental health professionals throughout. She was released from the psychiatric institution component of her sentence in the fall of 2011, earlier than the 4-year maximum, following assessments that her rehabilitation was progressing and that her expressions of remorse were considered genuine by the experts evaluating her. She enrolled as a student at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta, in September 2011, attending under her legal protections as a youth offender. In May 2016, her 10-year sentence reached its conclusion. A final review hearing was held before Justice Scott Brooker of the Court of Queen's Bench. Jasmine appeared via closed-circuit television from an undisclosed location. She thanked the judge, but offered no apology or expression of remorse during the hearing itself. Justice Brooker told her during the proceedings that he thought her parents and brother would be proud of her. That statement generated significant public reaction in Canada. Many people who had followed the case since 2006 found it difficult to reconcile the legal system's assessment of Jasmine's rehabilitation with the reality of what had happened to Mark Richardson, Deborah Richardson, and 8-year-old Tyler Jacob in their home on April 23, 2006. Following the completion of her sentence in 2016, Jasmine Richardson was freed of all court-ordered conditions, restrictions, and supervision. Under the terms of Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, her criminal record was scheduled to be expunged 5 years after the completion of her sentence, provided she committed no further offences during that period. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic affecting administrative processes, the expungement occurred a year ahead of schedule in 2020, 15 years after the incident rather than 16. Her record no longer exists in any legal form. Her identity is protected. She cannot be named in Canadian publications. She is currently in her early 30s and is living somewhere in Canada at a location that is not publicly known. The phrase used in Canadian media coverage to describe her outcome, before the legal protections around her identity made continued coverage difficult, was that she had become a poster child for rehabilitation. Legal professionals involved in youth justice pointed to her case as evidence that the Youth Criminal Justice Act's emphasis on rehabilitation over punishment could produce the outcomes it was designed to produce. Mark Richardson was 42 years old. Deborah Richardson was 48. Tyler Jacob Richardson was 8 years old and had gone to bed that night with a friend coming over the next morning for a play date. The friend was the one who looked through the window and saw what was inside. The community of Medicine Hat has not forgotten what happened on April 23, 2006, regardless of what the legal system's paperwork now says about the person responsible. The neighbours who lived near the Richardson home continued to discuss it years later. The case is taught in Canadian law schools as a reference point for discussions about youth sentencing, the limits of rehabilitation frameworks, and the tension between protecting young offenders and accounting for the severity of what they have done. Jasmine Richardson wrote in an email that it begins with eliminating them and ends with living with you. Mark and Deborah Richardson never knew that email existed. Tyler Jacob Richardson was 8 years old and had nothing to do with any of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes place in Pennsylvania, and it is the only one in this collection involving a daughter who did not act alone or through a romantic relationship. She acted alongside her own mother inside a small apartment over the course of 3 days, with 5 members of their extended family present, and none of them walking out alive. Dominique Decree. The Robert Morris Apartments sit on West Bridge Street in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, a small borough in Bucks County, directly across the Delaware River from Trenton, New Jersey. Morrisville is a working-class community of just under 10,000 people. The apartment complex is a standard residential building, the kind of place where families rent units and live in proximity to one another without necessarily knowing much about each other's daily lives. Unit S7 was home to Shana Decree, a 47-year-old woman, and her 21-year-old daughter Dominique Decree. Both of them lived there together. On February 25, 2019, at approximately 4 in the afternoon, officers from the Morrisville Borough Police responded to the Robert Morris Apartments and entered Unit S7. Inside a single bedroom, they found 5 people. All 5 were dead. They were Naira Smith, who was 25 years old, and Shana Decree's daughter from a prior relationship, making her Dominique's half-sister. Damon Decree Jr. was 13 years old, Shana's son and Dominique's younger brother. Jamila Campbell was 42 years old, Shana's sister, who had travelled from Trenton, New Jersey. And Jamila's 2 daughters, 9-year-old twin girls named Imani Allen and Erica Allen, were also among the dead. 5 people, 3 of them children, all of them found together in a single bedroom inside an apartment where both the mother and daughter who lived there were also present when police arrived. Shana Decree and Dominique Decree were taken into custody. What investigators uncovered in the days that followed was that the 5 victims had not all been found on the same day they were harmed. The incident had not been sudden. According to the timeline established through the investigation, the events had taken place across approximately 3 days, beginning around February 23rd and concluding on February 25th, 2019, the day the bodies were discovered. The cause of death for 4 of the 5 victims, Erica Allen, Imani Allen, Damon Decree Jr. and Naira Smith, was determined by the medical examiner to be homicidal asphyxia, meaning each was deprived of oxygen through physical means. Jamila Campbell, the 42-year-old aunt who had come from Trenton, was determined to have been killed by homicidal ligature strangulation, meaning something had been used around her neck. All 5 deaths were ruled homicides. The 5 victims ranged in age from 9 to 42. 3 of the 5 were children. When investigators spoke to Shana Decree in the aftermath of the discovery, she told them that the 5 victims had wanted to die. She said this was consensual. She said the people in that bedroom had been willing participants. Investigators did not accept this account, and the physical and forensic evidence did not support it. The medical examiner's findings were consistent with each victim having been actively deprived of oxygen, rather than having done anything voluntarily. The ages of Imani and Erica Allen, 9 years old, twin girls, made any claim of willing participation not just implausible, but legally and factually unsupportable. Shana and Dominique were each charged with 5 counts of first-degree homicide and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. During the investigation, both women were interviewed separately. The accounts they gave were inconsistent with each other in a specific and significant way. They provided different versions of who had been responsible for which victim. Each offered an account that placed varying degrees of responsibility on the other. This mutual inconsistency made it impossible to establish with precision who had done what to each specific victim, but it did not change the legal outcome. Under Pennsylvania law, criminal conspiracy means that each person who participated in a plan is responsible for the actions carried out in furtherance of that plan, regardless of which specific act each person physically committed. Both Shana and Dominique had been present throughout. Both were charged accordingly. Mental health evaluations were conducted on both defendants. Separate mental health professionals, brought in independently, each concluded that both Shana Decree and Dominique Decree had been suffering from severe mental illness at the time the events occurred. These findings were significant enough that prosecutors, defense attorneys, and the court ultimately agreed on a specific legal framework for resolving the case. In September 2020, both Shana Decree and Dominique Decree appeared in Bucks County Court before President Judge Wallace H. Bateman Jr. Both entered pleas of guilty but mentally ill to all 5 counts of first-degree homicide and the count of criminal conspiracy. This specific plea in Pennsylvania law acknowledges guilt while also formally recognizing that the defendant was suffering from a diagnosable mental illness at the time of the offense. It does not reduce the conviction or the sentence. It is a statement of legal and factual responsibility that incorporates a clinical acknowledgement of mental illness alongside it. Judge Bateman accepted the pleas. He described the case as horrific and sad at the same time. Under the terms of the negotiated plea, both Shana Decree and Dominique Decree were sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each of the 5 people found in that bedroom. Consecutive means the sentences follow one after another, rather than running at the same time. In practical terms, the distinction makes no difference when the sentence is life without the possibility of parole, which these sentences were. Neither Shana nor Dominique will ever leave prison. The sentencing proceeding was attended by approximately 16 relatives of both the defendants and the victims. The emotional weight in that courtroom was not simple or one-directional. These were not strangers. Ira Smith and Damon Decree Jr. were Shana's own children and Dominique's siblings. Jamila Campbell was Shana's sister. Imani and Erica Allen were Jamila's daughters, meaning they were Shana's nieces. Every single person found in that bedroom was a blood relative of the woman who lived in that apartment. Damon Decree Sr., the father of Damon Jr., and Dominique's father, spoke at the sentencing. He told the court that he had lost not just his 13-year-old son, but also his firstborn child, Dominique, to 5 life sentences in the same event. He said he would never get to watch his son grow up and share the experiences a father has with a son. All he had left, he said, were thoughts of what might have been. The lead prosecutor on the case, Chief Deputy District Attorney Christopher Reese, spoke to the media after the sentencing. He said he had never dealt with a case as heartbreaking as this one. He said he had never seen a case with this level of sadness and this level of loss. He told reporters that if they had children, they should go home and embrace them. If their parents were still alive, they should call them. He described it as a reminder that family is everything and that every moment with them should be treated as something worth protecting. District Attorney Matt Weintraub issued a formal statement following the sentencing. He said that what had happened in that apartment represented the loss of 5 lives, 3 of them children, at the hands of the 2 people in the world those children should have been safest with. He said that both Shana and Dominique would spend the rest of their lives separated from the rest of society as a consequence of what they had chosen to do. The case attracted significant attention within Bucks County and in Pennsylvania legal circles, not just because of the number of victims or their ages, but because of the specific combination of factors involved. 5 victims sharing blood connections with both perpetrators. A 3-day timeline during which the events unfolded inside a single apartment. Mental illness formally acknowledged within the conviction itself. And a daughter, Dominique, 21 years old, who had participated in the systematic harm of her own siblings and extended family members within the walls of the home she shared with her mother. The mental illness findings were not a technicality or a defense strategy that failed. They were the conclusion reached by independent clinical professionals who examined both defendants. What those findings could not do was alter the reality of what had been found in that bedroom on February 25, 2019. 5 people, 3 of them children, all of them dead. All of them related by blood to the 2 women charged. Naira Smith was 25 years old. She had a life outside that apartment, relationships, a future that ended in a bedroom in Morrisville. Damon Decree Jr. was 13. Jamila Campbell was 42 and had driven from Trenton, New Jersey, bringing her 2 9-year-old daughters with her. Imani and Erica Allen were twins. They were 9 years old. Dominique Decree is currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences in the Pennsylvania State Correctional System. She will not be released. She was 21 years old when the events in Unit S7 took place. Whatever combination of mental illness, circumstance, and the dynamic between herself and her mother produced the events of those 3 days in February 2019, the outcome is permanent. The 5 people who entered that apartment and did not come out are gone, and Dominique Decree will spend every remaining year of her life inside a prison cell because of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this collection moves back to Illinois, and it involves a 21-year-old man who spent years lying to everyone around him about who he was, hired his college roommate to carry out the plan, made sure he was 200 miles away when it happened, and then showed up at the reading of his parents' will, visibly furious when he discovered they had already changed it. Dana Ewell had built his money through hard work and discipline. He was a United States Air Force veteran who had turned his post-military life into a successful business career, founding a company called Western Piper Sales, Inc. that specialized in the sale of small aircraft. His wife Glee had devoted much of her adult life to public service and philanthropy. She had briefly worked as a Spanish translator for the CIA in the 1950s and later held a seat on the State Bar of California committee that evaluated candidates for judgeships. Their daughter, Tiffany, born in 1967, was a graduate student in her mid-20s. Their son, Dana, born January 28, 1971, was the younger of the 2 children and was enrolled at Santa Clara University, where he was pursuing a finance degree. The family lived in a ranch-style home in the Sunnyside area of Fresno, California, an upscale neighborhood of wide streets and well-maintained properties. Dale and Glee were not the kind of wealthy people who displayed their money. They lived modestly relative to what they had accumulated. Their assets, investments in the stock market, local farmland holdings, and the proceeds of Dale's aviation business, were estimated at somewhere between $7 and $8 million. They did not flaunt this. They did not throw it around. They saved carefully and lived carefully, the way people do when they have built something from nothing and understand exactly what it cost them. Their son Dana understood the money existed. What he did not share with his parents was any of the discipline that had created it. While Dana Ewell was a student at Santa Clara University, he was constructing an identity that had no relationship to reality. A local newspaper and the university's own yearbook both ran features on Dana in 1990, describing him as a self-made millionaire who was already enjoying the fruits of his own business success. He gave interviews about his entrepreneurial achievements. He described investment strategies and business ventures that did not exist. He wore Armani clothing. He spent money in ways that a college student supported by his parents had no legitimate basis to spend. He was performing a version of his father's life, the wealthy, successful businessman, while having done nothing to earn any part of it. When Dale and Glee Ewell found out what their son had been telling people, they were not amused. Dale in particular was a man who had built his fortune through genuine work and who took a dim view of his son fabricating accomplishments. The family's estate plan was modified in response to what they had learned. Rather than giving Dana access to the full inheritance upon their deaths, the plan was restructured so that Dana would receive the interest from a trust beginning at age 30 and the full principal of the trust at age 35. Extended family members who later spoke to investigators said that Dale had also been planning to cut off his direct financial support for Dana after his college graduation, having concluded that continued support was enabling behaviour that was doing his son no good. Dana was aware of these changes. When the estate plan was explained to him, he learned that he would not have access to the bulk of his parents' money for more than a decade after graduation, and only if they remained alive long enough for the trust structure to function as designed. If they died before those milestones, the timing of his access would depend on the specific legal structure Dale had put in place. What Dana did with this information was begin planning to remove the people standing between him and immediate access to the estate. He found his instrument in Joel Radovchich, a fellow student he had met at Santa Clara University. Radovchich was impressionable and loyal, and Dana had cultivated a friendship with him over time. Dana presented Radovchich with a proposition: help eliminate the Ewell family in exchange for a share of the inheritance that would follow. Radovchich agreed. The plan they constructed was detailed and deliberate. Dana would establish an airtight alibi by being visibly present somewhere far from Fresno on the day of the incident. He would arrange for Radovchich to have access to the family home and knowledge of the family's movements. Radovchich would carry out the plan alone, and the money would come afterward. Dana also ensured that Radovchich had the equipment needed, including helping to arrange the acquisition of the firearm that would be used, a silenced Intratec assault-style weapon. On Easter Sunday, April 19, 1992, Dale and Glee Ewell returned to their Sunnyside home from a weekend trip to the California coast with their daughter Tiffany. Dana was not with them. He was in San Francisco, approximately 200 miles away, spending the Easter weekend with his girlfriend Monica Zent and her family. He had been there the entire weekend, visible and accounted for, building the alibi that he needed. Joel Radovchich had been inside the Ewell home, waiting. He had positioned himself carefully, sitting on plastic sheeting and wearing multiple layers of latex gloves to avoid leaving any trace of his presence. He was armed with the silenced weapon. Tiffany Ewell, 24 years old, was the first to be shot when the family arrived home. Glee Ewell was shot 4 times. Dale Ewell arrived separately, coming in through the garage approximately 30 minutes after the women, and was shot once from behind as he walked inside. The recovered shell casings had been collected by Radovchich before he left the house, a detail that demonstrated the level of planning that had gone into the operation. The bodies were not discovered immediately. Dana, back in San Francisco, eventually contacted family friends in Sunnyside on Tuesday, April 21st, saying he had been unable to reach his parents. Those friends went to the house and found the 3 victims. They had been dead for approximately 2 days. The Fresno County Sheriff's Office launched a homicide investigation. Detectives John Souza and Chris Curtis were assigned to the case, and both would spend the next several years working it. The scene had the hallmarks of a planned incident rather than a random one. Whoever had been in that house had known the family's schedule, had prepared for the wait, had collected evidence from the scene before leaving, and had made a clean exit. This was not a burglary that went wrong. This was something else. Dana Ewell was among the people investigators spoke to in the immediate aftermath. He was cooperative, visibly present, and had the San Francisco alibi. On the surface, nothing pointed directly at him. Extended family members, however, began telling investigators things that shifted the focus. They described Dana as inordinately fixated on the details of the will after the deaths were discovered. They said he was visibly shaken and openly angry when he learned that most of the estate would not be accessible to him for years due to the trust structure his father had put in place. One account that emerged from the investigation was that Dana had also been systematically draining his grandmother's financial accounts during this period. Over a 3-year span, he had moved money from her accounts, which originally held around $400,000, leaving only $2,000 behind. Documents connected to his girlfriend Monica Zent's life also turned up in the financial records, including a payment of $17,000 to her university and $11,000 for flying lessons for both himself and Radovčić. Dana had more than 24 accounts spread across 14 different banks, some held jointly with his grandmother and others with his girlfriend. The investigation moved carefully. Detectives Sousa and Curtis built a surveillance operation that eventually covered both Southern California and the San Francisco Bay Area simultaneously, pulling in officers from other units to maintain coverage. They watched, they gathered records, they tracked financial movements, and they waited for something solid enough to act on. The break came in 1995, 3 years after the incident. An associate of Radovčić's named Philip Policastri eventually gave investigators information that connected Radovčić directly to the plan and to Dana Ewell. Policastri had personal knowledge of conversations that had taken place before April 19, 1992, in which Dana had discussed eliminating his family. His account gave investigators the foundation they needed to move the case forward. Both Dana Ewell and Joel Radovčić were arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree homicide, with aggravating circumstances that included multiple victims, homicide committed for financial gain, and homicide committed by lying in wait. All 3 aggravating factors were supported by the evidence. The homicide for financial gain factor alone made the charges eligible for the most serious available penalties under California law at the time. The trial that followed was one of the most complex and expensive criminal proceedings in Fresno County history. The prosecution's case was built on the financial motive, the alibi construction, the testimony of Policastri and others who had knowledge of conversations involving Dana, the forensic evidence from the scene, and the pattern of Dana's behavior in the months and years surrounding the incident. The defense challenged the reliability of witnesses and contested the physical evidence connecting Radovčić to the scene. Dana Ewell took the stand in his own defense. He told the jury that he had purchased the firearm for Radovčić because he believed Radovčić intended to sell it for profit. He also told the court that Radovčić had described his preparations to him: the plastic sheeting, the multiple layers of latex gloves, the positioning inside the house, framing it as something Radovčić had told him about, rather than something he had helped design. This account did not persuade the jury that Dana was an innocent person who happened to have a connection to the man who carried out the act. Dana's uncles, brothers of his father Dale, testified during the trial about the moment when the will was read and Dana discovered the trust structure his father had put in place. They described their nephew as visibly upset and angry at learning that access to the money had been tied to age milestones rather than the moment of his parents' deaths. For a jury evaluating motive, this testimony was significant. It placed Dana's anger over the estate plan on record through people who had witnessed it directly. The jury deliberated for 11 days. Even during deliberations, the jury found the case complex enough to require careful consideration. They noted during the process that they considered Policastri's testimony unreliable and believed he had played a larger role in the events than he had admitted. Despite these reservations about one witness, the weight of the overall evidence was sufficient. On July 11, 1998, the jury found both Dana Ewell and Joel Radovčić guilty of 3 counts of first-degree homicide. The sentencing phase presented its own complications. The jury was deadlocked on the question of penalty, unable to reach a unanimous decision about what the appropriate consequence should be for either man. Because of the deadlock, Judge Frank Creed declared a mistrial on the penalty phase specifically. Under California law, when a penalty phase results in a mistrial of this kind, the judge delivers the default sentence available under the circumstances. On July 20, 1998, Judge Creed sentenced both Dana Ewell and Joel Radovčić to life in prison without the possibility of parole, 3 life terms each, reflecting the 3 victims, to be served consecutively. The death penalty, which the charges had made legally available, was not imposed as a result of the jury's inability to reach a unanimous decision during the penalty phase. Dana Ewell, who had been 21 years old on Easter Sunday 1992, when Joel Radovčić waited inside the Sunnyside house, was sentenced at 27. He has been inside the California state prison system ever since. For a period after the sentencing, Dana was held at California State Prison in Corcoran in the Protective Housing Unit, which houses inmates who require separation from the general prison population for security reasons. He was later transferred. As of the most recent publicly available information, Dana Ewell is incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. He is in his early 50s. he will not be released. An ABC 30 reporter in Fresno communicated with Dana through prison mail for approximately 10 years following the conviction. During that correspondence, Dana wrote about having converted to Christianity and finding purpose through faith. In one letter written around the 30th anniversary of the incident in 2022, he wrote that he was grateful to be in prison because it was where he had begun to recognize how lost and depraved he had become. He described his pre-prison self as someone operating in prideful rebellion. Chris Curtis, one of the detectives who had worked the case for years and who reviewed the letters at the reporter's request, described Dana as a master manipulator and said that looking through the correspondence, he was not entirely sure whether that quality had gone away. Ben Ewell, Dale's brother and Dana's uncle, published a memoir about the case and its aftermath. The book, titled Sunday Afternoons and Other Times Remembered, describes receiving the phone call from a district attorney contact on the morning the bodies were discovered. Ben wrote about growing up with his brothers, about Dale building his business and his family in Fresno, and about the years of investigation that followed. He also wrote about Dana directly. His perspective, as someone who watched a nephew he had known since birth be convicted of arranging the elimination of his brother, sister-in-law, and niece, is documented in the book as something that does not have clean emotional resolution. Tiffany Ewell was 24 years old. She was a graduate student with her own life developing in front of her. She was the first one shot when the family came home from the coast that Easter Sunday. Glee Ewell had spent her adult life in public service, evaluating judicial candidates and translating for intelligence operations, and giving her time to causes that had nothing to do with her own interests. Dale Ewell had served in the Air Force and then built a business from the ground up and accumulated a fortune across decades of disciplined work. All three of them were shot inside their own home by a man hiding on plastic sheeting, waiting for them to arrive, because the 21-year-old son and brother wanted access to the money before the ages of 30 and 35. The estate plan that Dale had put in place, the one that so visibly enraged Dana when he learned about it after the deaths, was structured precisely because Dale had recognized something about his son that worried him. He had seen the fabricated interviews, the non-existent business ventures, the performance of wealth that Dana had built at university. He had responded by making sure that even if something happened to him and Glee, the money would not flow immediately and entirely to a 21-year-old who had demonstrated no capacity to manage it responsibly. The irony is that Dana's response to being cut off from immediate access was to arrange the event that triggered the trust, which then still did not give him what he wanted, because investigators had already identified him as the primary suspect before the estate question even became relevant. Dale Ewell saw something in his son that led him to change the will. He was right about what he saw. He just did not anticipate how far it would go. Dana Ewell is currently serving 3 consecutive life sentences at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. He will die there. The aviation business his father built, the farmland, the stock investments, the $7 to $8 million that Dana decided he could not wait for, none of it came to him. The estate passed through legal channels that had nothing to do with Dana's plans. The dreams he had of living the wealthy life he had been performing for years at Santa Clara University ended in a courtroom in Fresno in 1998, and the cell in Ione is where they will remain. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.